The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $85, and Del Marchetti laughed so hard he had to slap his own knee to keep his balance. It was the kind of laugh a man performs more than feels, meant to travel across a crowd and land on one particular set of shoulders, and the shoulders it landed on belonged to Harlan Beaudry, who did not turn around. The date was the 12th of May, 1987, and the place was the old Rensler property, 3 miles south of Pell's Corner, Indiana, where a hand-lettered sign at the county road promised a full estate sale, no reserves, cash, and check only, rain or shine. It had been shine all morning and threatened rain by 3, and the auction tent smelled of trampled grass and coffee gone cold in styrofoam cups. The object in question sat under the tent's eastern flap on a pair of splintered sawhorses. It was a jukebox, though. You had to know what you were looking at to call it one. The chrome had gone the color of pond water. The plastic arch above the selector was cracked in 3 places and yellowed to the shade of an old tooth. 2 of the pilaster tubes were shattered clean through, and the third had a hairline fracture that ran like a nervous signature down its length. The turntable, when someone had lifted the lid earlier and let it drop again, showed a spindle bent perhaps 5 degrees off true, and the amplifier chassis inside had a scorch mark shaped like a black flower blooming out of the transformer. The cabinet was oak, water-stained, and the coin mechanism had been pried at with something narrow and unkind. On the front, in faded gold decal that had once been proud, you could still make out the word Wurlitzer, and below it, a model number worn nearly smooth by fingers that had pressed the same 3 or 4 songs 1,000 times each. Harlan Beaudry was 69 years old. That May. He was lean, the way a fence post is lean, stooped a little at the shoulders from 47 years of leaning over benches and work benches and the bellies of radios and televisions and, later, the guts of jukeboxes and pinball machines and pipe organs and anything else, with a coil and a wire and a soul made of solder. His face was cut through with the fine, deep lines a man gets from squinting at small work under yellow bulbs. He wore a gray work cap with the brim gone soft, a chambray shirt washed to the color of a January sky, a canvas jacket the shade of tobacco, and blue work pants that had been mended at the knee with careful stitches by his late wife Ellen, who had been dead 9 years that spring. His hands, when he lifted them from his pockets to sign the auction ticket, showed the map of his life. Burned scars on the pads of 2 fingers, a crooked left thumb that had been broken and set by himself with a popsicle stick in 1962. Nails cut short and clean, a wedding band worn thin as a wire on the 3rd finger of the left hand. Del Marchetti was 51 and looked 40 from 20 feet away, and 60 from 3. He was heavy through the middle in the way of men who eat lunch at desks and dinner at steakhouses, ruddy in the cheeks, clean-shaven to the pink. He wore a sport coat the color of a traffic cone over a white polo with the logo of Marchetti Vending and Amusements stitched above the heart. A gold rope chain sat on his collarbone. A gold pinky ring caught the tent light when he waved his hand. His truck out in the field was a new Silverado, red as a fire engine, with the same logo painted on the doors, and it was parked at an angle that made it hard for anyone else to leave. He owned 3 routes of cigarette machines, 24 pool tables in bars from Terre Haute to Kokomo, and a warehouse in Lafayette, full of what he called product and what everyone else called noise. When the gavel came down, Del threw his head back and hollered across the tent. He said, "Well, boys, Harlan just bought himself a coffin for a dead radio." He said, $85 for a Wurlitzer, with no light, no sound, no song, no soul. He said we ought to name that thing. He looked around at the men who worked his routes and laughed because they were paid to laugh. And he said, "We'll call her the Tombstone, because that's what she is. That's a tombstone with a coin slot." Harlan folded the yellow ticket into his shirt pocket, buttoned the pocket flap, and walked to the clerk's table to pay in worn bills counted out one at a time. What Del did not see, because Del read price tags and Harlan read machines, was that under the scorched flower on the amplifier chassis, someone many years back had run a bypass wire in a hand so careful it looked machined. and that the bent spindle was bent in a way that meant it had been struck once by a falling object, not warped by heat, which meant the motor beneath might still be sound. And that on the inside of the coin door, in pencil so faint you had to tilt it toward the light, someone had written a date and 2 initials and a small drawn heart, and the date was August of 1953, and the initials were R and M. Harlan had seen the initials before he bid. He had seen the pencil heart, and he had seen the careful bypass wire, and he had felt, in that same hard-to-name way a man knows a coming rain by his knees, that this machine had a story inside it that had not yet finished being told. He had learned to trust that feeling from a man named Angelo Perry, who had taken him on as an apprentice in a shop above a shoe repair in Gary in the winter of 1940. Angelo had been a small man with enormous hands and a habit of speaking Italian to the machines when he thought no one was listening. He had told Harlan once, holding up a length of solder and turning it in the light, that a joint is a promise, and a promise held for 40 years is a kind of prayer. He had said that a machine remembers who built it, the way a house remembers who lived in it, and that a man who works with patience is only listening to that memory out loud. Harlan had been 18 then, and he had not fully understood, and now he was 69, and he did. If you have ever watched a quiet person work with their hands and known, without being told that what you were seeing was worth more than what the world would ever pay for it, then you already understand what this story is about, and you might take a second to subscribe. Because the rest of what happened that spring is the kind of thing that gets lost if nobody tells it. Harlan and his neighbor's boy, a thin 19-year-old named Cal Whitman who was learning the trade on Saturdays because his mother had asked, and because Harlan had said yes without making a thing of it, loaded the Wurlitzer onto the bed of Harlan's 1971 Ford. It took the 2 of them and a set of moving straps and a plank, and when they had it lashed down, Dell walked over with a paper cup of coffee and stood with one hand on the tailgate as if he owned it. He said, "Harlan, you tell me when the tombstone sings, and I'll come dance at the funeral." Harlan touched the brim of his cap and said, "All right, Dell." Then he got behind the wheel and drove the 7 miles home at 35 miles an hour, with Cal following behind in his mother's Nova, and the sky over the fields went the color of an old nickel, and the first drops began to hit the windshield just as they turned into the gravel drive. There's a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it does not. Harlan's shop stood behind his house in a converted dairy barn, with the stalls torn out and a concrete floor poured level in 1968. Fluorescent tubes hung on chains from the rafters. A long workbench ran the length of the north wall, and above it, on pegboard, hung tools, ordered by size and function in a system only Harlan fully understood, but that Cal was beginning to see the logic of. There were tube testers from 3 decades. There were oscilloscopes with round green faces. There were coffee cans of resistors sorted by color code, and baby food jars of screws sorted by thread. There was a small radio on a shelf that played the farm report at noon, and the ball game at night, and Ellen's photograph in a wood frame beside it, and a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Grandpa," which their granddaughter had given him the Christmas before she moved to Portland. They set the Wurlitzer on the low dolly and rolled it under the brightest bank of tubes, and Harlan stood looking at it for a long time before he touched it. Cal, who had learned already not to fill silences, waited. Ward got around Pell's Corner, the way word does in a town of 1,100. By Thursday, the coffee counter at Dee's Diner had a running joke about the tombstone. By Friday, a man at the feed store told Cal's mother, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that old Harlan had finally lost the last of it. And wasn't it a shame? By Saturday afternoon, Elmer Kroll, who had known Harlan since Korea and who ran the hardware store on Main, came out to the shop with a jar of his wife's rhubarb preserves as a pretext, and stood scratching the back of his neck. "Elmer," said Harlan, "I got to ask." He said, "Is there anything in that thing worth what you paid, or is Dell right for once in his life?" Harlan wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at the machine and then at Elmer and said, "It'll play." Elmer said, "When?" Harlan said, "When?" It's ready." Elmer nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has said what he came to say and been answered in a language he does not quite speak, and he left the preserves on the bench and drove back to town. Harlan did not answer the gossip, because the gossip was not a question the gossip wanted answered. The Wurlitzer had been built in 1948 in North Tonawanda, New York, and it had ridden a freight car west to a distributor in Chicago, and from there to a roadhouse called the Blue Elm, outside Rensselaer, Indiana, where it had stood against a knotty pine wall for 6 years and taken the nickels of farm hands and traveling salesmen, and one particular young couple who came in on Saturday nights to dance in the sawdust to a record they played so many times the shellac wore through by the summer of 1953. Her name was Ruth Halloran. She was 22 and taught 4th grade in Rensselaer. His name was Michael Doyle. He was 24 and worked at his father's implement dealership and could fix any tractor made before the war. The record they played was a Patti Page song, and the initials in pencil on the inside of the coin door were theirs. Put there by Michael one August night when Ruth had gone to the powder room and he had bribed the owner with $1 to let him open the front for 30 seconds. He had drawn the heart because he had planned to ask her the following Saturday, and he had a ring in his jacket pocket already, a small thing his mother had given him, and he wanted a witness other than the sky. He did not ask her the following Saturday. On the Tuesday before, driving home late from Lafayette in a hard rain, Michael Doyle had gone off the highway on a curve outside Wolcott and had died in the cab of a 1949 Ford pickup, with the ring still in his coat and a receipt in his wallet for a wedding band he had put money down on that morning. Ruth Halloran did not come to the Blue Elm again. She married a man named Corbin in 1956, moved to Illinois, buried him in 1979, and moved back to Rensselaer to be near her sister. She was 66 that May of 1987 and lived in a small brick house on Cherry Street and taught piano lessons to 3 children a week. She had not thought of the Wurlitzer in years, though sometimes on August nights a bar of that old song would come to her uninvited, and she would stand at her kitchen sink and let the water run until it went cold on her hands. What almost no one knew was that Michael Doyle's father, Vincent Doyle, had come to the Blue Elm 1 week after the funeral and had paid the owner cash for the jukebox and had it hauled to his own barn and had done something inside it. And what almost no one knew after that was that when Vincent died in 1961 and his farm was sold to pay debts, the Wurlitzer had gone to auction and passed from hand to hand across 3 decades, sitting silent in a garage in Monon, and then a basement in Reynolds, and then a shed on the Rensselaer place where a leaking roof had finished what neglect had started, and where Harlan had found it under a tarp the morning of the preview, and had felt his knees hum. If you have come this far, you may want to hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part that has been waiting almost 34 years to be told. Harlan worked on the Wurlitzer for 11 days. He worked in the mornings before the heat came up, and in the evenings after supper, and Cal came Saturday and Sunday, and the Wednesday afternoon he had free from the lumberyard. Harlan began by taking photographs, because Angelo Perry had taught him that a machine is a paragraph and you do not rewrite a paragraph without first reading it. He photographed every screw before he turned it and every wire before he pulled it. He labeled the harnesses with masking tape and a pencil in his small exact hand. He drained the old grease from the mechanism and cleaned each gear with a toothbrush and kerosene. He tested the motor on the bench and found it, as he had suspected, sound. He straightened the spindle in a vise, with a soft copper jaw, and a torque he measured by feel, because he had measured that same feel 10,000 times. The amplifier he set aside for last, because the scorched transformer was the heart of it, and the heart is what you rebuild when the rest of the body is ready to receive it. The pilaster tubes he could not save. He drove to a shop in Fort Wayne on the Tuesday of the 2nd week, and came back with 3 replacements, wrapped in newspaper on the seat beside him, and he set them on the bench and did not install them yet. Cal asked, on the Saturday, why he had bought the machine. Harlan was bent over the coin door with a jeweler's loop. He said, "Come here, Cal." Came. Harlan tilted the door to the light and said, "Tell me what you see." Cal squinted and said, "Initials, and a date, and a little heart." Harlan said that heart was drawn by a man who thought he had time. He said that machine was rebuilt once, careful, by somebody who loved somebody. He said, "You can feel the difference between work done for money and work done for a person, and this was done for a person." Cal said, "How do you know?" Harlan said, "Look at the bypass wire on the amp. It's laid in like a stitch." He said, "A man in a hurry does not stitch." Cal looked for a long time and then nodded once, slow, and did not ask again. On the 11th evening, a Wednesday, with rain again on the barn roof and the farm report done and the ball game an hour off, Harlan finished the amplifier. He had rewound the transformer himself over 3 nights, working under a magnifier with hands that did not shake the way they sometimes did lifting a coffee cup, because the work steadied him the way it always had. He had replaced the scorched capacitors and cleaned the tube sockets with a swab, and tested each tube on the old Hickok, and set the good ones in and the questionable ones aside. He had run the bypass wire back exactly as he had found it, because to change it would have been to erase a signature, and he was not in the business of erasing signatures. He lowered the amplifier chassis back into the cabinet. He connected the harnesses one by one and checked each against the taped labels. He put a 45 on the turntable that Cal had brought over from his mother's records, an old Patty Page, because Harlan had asked for one, and Cal's mother had one, and had not asked why. Harlan stood back. Cal stood back. Harlan wiped his hands on the shop rag and reached for the wall switch. The sound that came from the Wurlitzer when the power went in was the sound Angelo Perry used to call the breath. A small mechanical sigh, as of a thing waking from a long sleep, and then the low, warm hum of the amplifier coming up. And then, after a moment, the pilaster tubes brightening from the bottom, orange to gold, to a soft white, and the arch above the selector, glowing a gentle rose, and the whole machine, standing in the barn like a small church lit from within. Harlan did not move for a long moment. Then he reached and pressed the selector, and the mechanism, 40 years quiet, turned and lifted the record and lowered it, and the needle found the groove. And Patty Page began to sing in the barn where dairy cows had once stood, and Cal Whitman, 19 years old, set his hand on the workbench and did not know why his eyes had gone hot. Harlan let the song play through. He did not speak. When it was done, he crossed to the machine and opened the coin door and shone a small flashlight up into the cabinet from below, because there was one more thing he had noticed on the second day and had not spoken of, which was that the floor of the cabinet was thicker than it ought to have been by perhaps 1 1/4 inches. He took a screwdriver and worked at a seam he had already located. A thin plywood panel came free in his hands. Behind it, wedged flat against the bottom of the cabinet, were 3 things. There was a manila envelope, brittle at the edges, sealed with brown tape, gone the color of tea. There was a small cloth pouch that clanked when he lifted it. And there was an envelope of blue stationery with a woman's name written on the front in a young man's hand, and the name was Ruth. Harlan sat down on the shop stool and did not open anything for a while. Then he opened the manila envelope. Inside were documents. A bill of sale for the Wurlitzer, dated the 27th of August, 1953, made out to Vincent Doyle. A typed letter, single-spaced, from Vincent to whoever might one day find what he had hidden, explaining that his son Michael had loved a girl named Ruth Halloran, and had meant to give her a ring and had died before he could, and that he, Vincent, could not bear to see the machine they had danced to, sold off to strangers, and had bought it, and had hidden inside it the ring his son had chosen, and the money his son had saved. Toward a house because he did not trust his own creditors, and did not trust his own weakness, and had meant to give it to Ruth when he was stronger, and had never been stronger, and had died in 1961 with the secret still in the cabinet. The letter asked, in careful sentences, that whoever found these things would please carry them to Ruth Halloran, if she still lived, and tell her that Michael had been on his way home to ask. The cloth pouch held a small gold ring with a chip of diamond, and $420 in 10s and 20s, from the early 1950 seconds, banded with a brittle rubber band that broke when Harlan touched it. The blue envelope held a letter Michael had written and not yet given. Harlan did not read past the first line. He folded it and put it back. He could have kept it. The ring alone was worth something. The bills were collector's money by then. No one in Pell's Corner knew what was in the cabinet, and no one would ever have known. Del Marchetti would have gone on calling it a tombstone, and Harlan could have quietly sold the ring in Fort Wayne and put the money toward the property taxes that had crept up on him that spring, and nobody living would have been the poorer. He closed the envelope. He put everything into a paper grocery sack. He said, "Cal will close up, and in the morning we've got to drive." They drove to Rensselaer on Thursday morning in the old Ford. Cal beside him because Harlan had asked, and because Cal had said yes, without making a thing of it. They found the small brick house on Cherry Street. Harlan knocked. Ruth Corbin, who had been Ruth Halloran, opened the door in a green cardigan with her reading glasses pushed up in her white hair. Harlan took off his cap. He said, "Ma'am, my name is Harlan Beaudry." He said, "I fix old machines." He said, "I bought a Wurlitzer at an auction, and inside it were some things that belonged to you." He gave her the grocery sack. He said, "There's a letter in there that explains it better than I can." He said, "I'm sorry it took so long." Then he touched the brim of his cap and turned and walked back to the truck before she could gather herself to speak, because he did not want thanks, and because he knew she needed to be alone with what she was holding. Cal drove home. Harlan sat with his hands on his knees and looked out the window at fields, the color of new green, and did not say anything for the first 20 miles. Word got back to Pell's Corner the way word does. Ruth Corbin's sister told the minister, and the minister told his wife. And by the following Saturday, the coffee counter at Dee's Diner had a new story, and it was not the one about the tombstone. Del Marchetti heard it at his warehouse in Lafayette on the Monday after, and did not laugh. He said very little for a week, and then he said very little for a month, and by the fall of 1989, his business had gone under from debts he had been outrunning for years, and he moved to a place in Florida to sell timeshares, and was not much heard from again. Ruth Corbin used part of the money to have the Wurlitzer restored the rest of the way, though Harlan had already done the hard work, and she donated it to the Jasper County Historical Museum in Rensselaer, where it stands to this day against a wall painted the color of a summer night, with a small brass plaque that tells the true story of Michael Doyle and the promise held for 34 years in the floor of a cabinet. Harlan went once to see it, on a Wednesday evening in September when the museum stayed open late. He stood across the room and watched 2 teenagers press the selector, and heard the breath he knew and the low warm hum, and saw the arch light up, rose, and he watched them dance, a little awkward and laughing to a song older than their parents. Then he put his cap back on and walked out to the truck and drove the 7 miles home under a sky going the color of an old nickel, and he made himself a cup of coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table across from Ellen's empty chair, and he was, in the quiet way he had always been, satisfied. So I will leave it with you. If you had opened that cabinet alone in your barn on a Wednesday night with a ring in your hand and $420 nobody was looking for and a name on an envelope, you could have burned in the stove. Would you have driven to Rensselaer in the morning? Or would you have told yourself that 34 years was long enough for anyone to wait?